Before you take a listen to this episode, over the weekend, PGA Tour player Grayson Murray took his life at the age of 30 years old. And it got me thinking about a conversation we recently had with Representative Seth Moulton about the 988 suicide lifeline that him and another representative, Chris Stewart out of Utah, put together legislation wise years ago and got up and running. If you're thinking about suicide, you're worried about a friend or a loved one, or you just want some emotional support, the 988 Lifeline Network is available 24/7 across the United States. Please text or call 988 or go to 988lifeline.org today. Hey, everybody. Welcome into an all-new episode of the Can We Please Talk podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon, but Nick Savary is not here, everybody. I instead decided to kick him out. No, he's on vacation. He's enjoying the holiday break, but joining me right now, as always, friend of the show, NPR politics reporter. She's been covering everything that's been happening in Manhattan with the Trump trial, Ximena Bustillo. Ximena, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm good. I'm tired, but I'm good.
we're gonna get into why you're tired in just a second.
Yeah.
On the program today, closing arguments begin this week in the Manhattan trial for the former president, like we just mentioned. Good thing for us, we have somebody who has been sitting in that courtroom for weeks now, tired. Ximena and I are going to break down all the latest in the trial and more. Plus, later on in the program, there was a rally in my neck of the woods, Ximena, in the South Bronx, out there in Crotona Park, where I'm actually from, thrown by what? It says Donald Trump? Donald Trump's in the South Bronx. The former president's making stops in traditional blue areas. Why, Ximena? Ximena and I are going to get into that in just a bit. Before I say hello to Ximena and we do a deep dive into everything that she's been doing in her day job. Some housekeeping notes here. As always, all new episodes of Double Jab Podcasts are out there over on leonmedianetwork.com, where you can listen to it wherever you get your pods. This week, Rich is joined by WBA super lightweight continental title holder Kevin Brown ahead of his big fight with Idalberto Umara happening May 31st at the Caribe Royale in Orlando. If you don't live in the Orlando area, you can watch the fight on DAZN. Download the DAZN app wherever you get your apps. Or if you're living in the Orlando area, head to Ticketmaster.com or click the link in our show notes right now for a special offer on the tickets. You're not going to want to miss this fight. I will be at the fight. So if you happen to live in the Orlando area, come on by, say hello, some nonstop action there. And always listen to the Double Jab podcast, over on LeonMediaNetwork.com or wherever you get your pods. All right. Ad read. Well, not really an ad read. It's a programming read there, but that's out the way. Ximena, tell me a little bit about how are you doing? You and I have been texting, obviously, back and forth. You've been doing some media, PBS. You've been going on News Nation, talking about the trial. Give the people out there that are not journalists, not reporters, like some insight into like your day job. Like, why are you tired? Let's talk about it. How are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm good. I mean, it's a lot to track. I have been covering former President Donald Trump's Manhattan criminal trial, and this is historic, as we say for a lot of things these days, right? Historic, but it is the first criminal trial for a sitting or former US president. He is currently facing criminal charges in other states, Georgia, Florida, and Washington, D.C. specifically, but those are in various stages of delays. And so the Manhattan trial was the first one to actually go into a trial phase. And we are in, week 4 or 5, depending on if you count jury selection as a part of those weeks. A little over 4 weeks of testimony for sure is what we have listened to, plus a week of jury selection process. And it is likely that the jury will get the case to deliberate next week. So in that home stretch, so you can kind of feel it weighing.
I was going to say for you, when NPR asked you to go on assignment and do this, what was coming some of your first reaction? Because obviously Nick and I are not reporters in the field. We don't know what it's like. At least I haven't done it in forever to get, a network to say, hey, do you mind working the trial of a former president? Probably the only one that's going to happen this year. What was some of your initial reactions when that happened?
Yeah, so at the beginning, I had freshly moved to New York, and they had asked me if I could also cover the Trump criminal trials in New York. And at the time, there were two others. He went through two civil lawsuits, a civil fraud lawsuit involving his flagship Trump organization, where he himself was a defendant, and as were his kids and family, but also a civil defamation trial against former columnist E. Jean Carroll. And this was the second defamation trial between the two. And so that those two for sure, and maybe this criminal trial, right? As I mentioned, he was facing other criminal trials, and it was kind of up in the air which one would go first, if it would be Georgia, if it would be DC, if it would be Florida, if it would be New York. And so we didn't really know for sure that this is the one that was going to go. So I said, ability, yes, I'm a reporter, so sure, can figure it out, navigate the mazes of Capitol Hill a lot. I think I can figure out a courtroom or two. Definitely very different, but I think some of the skills are there.
That's so interesting because, like you just mentioned, you've done a lot of reporting, and like you mentioned before, covering things on Capitol Hill, and now it's a little bit different. You got to go into a courtroom setting, sit there. We're in the courtroom. Take us inside a little bit first before we get into the overall trial and your impressions. But like,
Mm-hmm.
are you allowed to actually take photos? Because we've seen Getty posting images, and so obviously there are people that are allowed to take photos. What are reporters allowed to
Mm-hmm.
do in the courtroom?
So it is a pretty controlled environment for the media, and this all got pretty heavily negotiated beforehand, which I personally, as a media nerd, find very interesting, kind of some of the processes behind that. So there are still photographers that get to go into the courtroom just for a few seconds. I mean, I think it's barely a few minutes at the very start of each trial day, and those are the ones who grab photos of the former president sitting right there every day, but they're the only ones that get to do that, and they only get to take a photo of the former president. That's why they all tend to be kind of forward looking at about the same angle. There is a TV crew as well that rotates in the hallway, as well as those same still photos. So that's how we get those hallway shots that you see, and we've seen some of those be very impressive as Trump brings guests and they all line up right behind him. Sometimes it's just him and his lawyer. That's the close-up shot. But inside the courtroom, and even in the overflow room, we are not allowed to record. We are not allowed to take video, and we are not allowed to take photos. And there have been reporters and members of the public that have been caught doing that and have been immediately escorted out. There are various reasons for that. First of, in just a courtroom, sometimes it's really rare to even have access to technology. And so access to our phones, access to our computers, that was something that had to be negotiated. But the other thing here is that there's a lot of protection around the jury and making sure that the jury stays anonymous. And so that's why, there's no photo, no video anytime the jury's in movement, but particularly also in that main courtroom. So I've seen the jury because I've been in the main courtroom, so I can see them person to person, but any kind of effort that could potentially photograph a juror, potentially take a video of a juror, there has been a lot of control around that in order to protect them.
I like that. See, this is why we started this show, subject matter experts, Ximena. That's great breakdown. I wanted, before we actually get into the trial, because there's a lot to get into with the trial. And again, for people that maybe haven't been following it, you came on, I think, I want to say a couple months ago before all of this, telling us you were going to be covering this. So now it's perfect as it's winding down to have you back on. But first and foremost, and I know you've gotten a chance to ask the former president a question and he's answered you before.
Mm-hmm.
What is it like covering him? What is it like asking him a question? Or is it sometimes overblown the way the relationship between the press, the core press that's following the president around? Is it overblown sometimes the way Trump interacts with members of the media? What have been your impressions of covering him and asking him questions that he's actually answered?
I mean, he is absolutely very media friendly in that sense. He has made sure to speak to members of the press in almost every single one of his trials, if not every single one of his New York trials that I have personally been covering. He does this in different ways. Sometimes he stands out in the hall and gives speeches and does sometimes answer a question or two or a few more. He has sometimes held entire press conferences at 40 Wall Street, which is one of his big buildings in Manhattan, where he does take a few questions. And, I think a lot of members of the media, myself included, have taken advantage of that opportunity to also ask him questions about things that he's running on, about other contemporary issues such as fights within Capitol Hill, other things that might be happening in the world that he might be willing to be asked and answer, more so than just whatever's happening in the trial, because that script is pretty set. We tend to know what he's going to say on those issues, but he is a front runner for the GOP nominee. He's the presumptive nominee. He is running for president, and this is an opportunity for us also as journalists to ask him more than just the immediate why he's here.
Amen. I'm so glad you said that, because we're going to get into the campaign in the next segment.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get into the trial overall, because again, Nick and I have made bones about this. And obviously, when you talk to legal analysts like we've had on the program, everybody has always said, well, this is the weakest of the four. But unfortunately, this is the one that's actually going to happen. We know about the delays and happening in Georgia. We know about what's going on with Jack Smith. The Supreme Court is still hearing some things related to some of these pretrial motions. So we get the New York one. For people that have not been following it, the prosecution has been calling different witnesses. Obviously, Michael Cohen was one of their star witnesses, who obviously was a former attorney for the former president. Give us the 30,000-foot overview as the prosecution presented its case, and then the defense presented their case, and they only called two witnesses, and the former president didn't speak or wasn't put on the stand himself. Give us a summation of like the trial right now, and all of the witnesses that have been called, and where we stand right now as we head to closing arguments.
Mm-hmm. So the prosecution has been very chronological in their explanation of their argument and their case. So this all boils down to 34 allegedly falsified business records. These business records are the invoices, the ledgers, and the checks that Trump used to pay Michael Cohen. Now, Michael Cohen received that payment, the prosecution says, because he had paid off adult film star Stormy Daniels in the month leading up to the 2016 election to keep quiet about an alleged affair. So the prosecution is arguing primarily two things. Trump was involved and knew and helped lead a scheme to keep information quiet that could have dissuaded voters, from voting for him, but also that these payments were falsely labeled. They were labeled as legal retainers, simply paying your lawyer, but they were not simply paying your lawyer. They were reimbursements for a settlement to a adult film star. And so there's, some tax components there as well that they are arguing. So we will get the final jury charges and instruction likely on Wednesday morning after closing arguments finish on Tuesday. And that is where the judge will clearly explain to the jury what the laws are at play here, what they need to decide whether or not Trump broke or violated. Now, the defense, in theory, and the judge explained this very clearly, in theory does not need to bring up a case. The burden of proof is on the prosecution. Prosecution has to do really all the work. And then the defense, all they have to do is cast doubt on whatever the prosecution is arguing. And in a sense, they've been arguing their case this whole time because they've gotten a chance to cross-examine and even sometimes re-cross-examine several, like all the witnesses that have been brought up. All 20 of them, actually. I think there's maybe been one or two they haven't spent that much time on. And those were, some more custodial type witnesses. And so they have also been laying out their case. They just don't have to present as much at the forefront. But they did bring up two of their own witnesses to bring up. And the defense's case is basically none of this is illegal. They say, non-disclosures and settlement agreements are not illegal. They had an interesting line in their opening statements where they even said influencing an election is not illegal. It's called democracy. And so that kind of shows in what way they're going to gear the jury, where it's, things might be weird, they might be shady, they might be suspicious, but it's not illegal to do those things or be this way. There's also been very interesting focuses on the backstories, and we can get into some of the witnesses that testified. Everyone tends to be a little bit unlikable. No one has the purest of intentions, and the defense really is leaning into that argument of, everybody was in it for their own here.
You just fed into the follow-up. Let's stay on it. Obviously, everybody makes about Stephanie Clifford, as Nick likes to say. If Sylvester Stallone was on trial, they wouldn't say Rambo's on trial. They would say Sylvester Stallone. Her name is Stephanie Clifford, which I learned in an episode. It made me laugh because it's true. I had been saying Stormy Daniels. Nick made that point. So everybody's pointing to her, couple of days of testimony, Michael Cohen's couple of days of testimony. Everyone knows who they are. She has a documentary out on Peacock right now. He's an MSNBC contributor. He has his own podcast. He's been very vocal about, the former president, what he did for him, and he's also been very memeable with respect to his answers in different what you call it, congressional hearings and things like that. So, I'm curious for you. Besides those two, what's something that's kind of getting downplayed in all of this? Like from all the witnesses, you said there was about 20 witnesses. What are some things that maybe you noticed that like other people haven't been focusing on that maybe the jury will focus on when they're deliberating about this, that you maybe stood out to Ximena Bustillo that you think would maybe translate to one of the jurors, whether they find innocence or guilt?
Yeah, I think there are definitely a couple things that stood out, even just not in the two main testimonies. And one thing about Stephanie Stormy that I found very interesting is when asked her name on the record, she actually did say Stormy Daniels, and that's what she wanted to be referred to in the trial. And so I thought that that was, a very interesting move on her part, from that very first day. And maybe that's something the jurors also noticed, and I don't know how they're gonna interpret that or, if it matters, but it definitely is what she is going for. But I think, in terms of other things that stood out to me, I do think that the way that the defense went about some of the witnesses was very interesting, including in some instances using former and or current Trump administration and organization employees as almost character witnesses for the former president. We had Hope Hicks, who used to have an office right outside the Oval Office, as well as Madeline Westerhout, who was fired from the White House and very much regrets it and cried on the stand about it. And there were just a few emotional moments like that where either the jury will buy it or they absolutely won't, and that can help or hurt the defense. At the same time, the prosecution was very chronological in how they presented their case, and I think that that is something that will help the jury when eventually deciding whether this is a guilty or not guilty or a partial guilty situation, just simply because there are a lot of players here. The timeline is also very long, going all the way back to 2006 when Trump and Daniels first met, to all the things that crammed and happened in the maybe 3 months before the election to the 3 months after the election, and the different players and people all at each part of the process. And so being able to keep track of that is has been a lot for the journalists there. I can't even imagine for the jurors that don't have access to the internet while they're listening to all this.
All right, Jimena, trial is winding down. Okay, closing arguments. I was going to ask you if you were in the juror box, which direction would you lean? We're not going to do that because you're a reporter. You're an established reporter with NPR, right? So let's ask, with all of the evidence that's been introduced right now, and again, we're taping right now, so we're not hearing closing arguments. That's happening on the Tuesday after the holiday break. But regardless of what happens there, unless somebody gives one of the most miracle performances of all time since My Cousin Vinny, what do you think this jury, after they get the instructions and after the closing arguments and everything that we just talked about with all the witnesses, which direction do you think the jury will lean? Now that you've been covering this, that you've basically laid out what the prosecution's case is, and the defense really not doing much, almost kind of saying to themselves, "Hey, maybe they haven't proved their case. Why would we trip ourselves up and put the former president on the stand?" What direction? What sense are you getting from people as you're down there in the courthouse? There's got to be people putting prognosticator hats on over there at the courthouse. What direction is everyone kind of thinking that this will go verdict wise?
I think a lot of people have agreed that trying to predict a jury is worse than trying to predict an election. Like, it is such a toss up. And the reason it is such a toss up is because there are 12 of them, 12 completely different people with completely different backgrounds and ways of processing and tracking information. We cannot even begin to imagine how they are all going to reconcile that. And maybe it's a situation where they all go back into the room and they all agree from the very beginning and call it good. Maybe they don't and have to hash it out. Sorry, I have a cat. And they have to hash it out. But we really won't know. And it has been, for going on 5-ish weeks of testimony, that is a long time to sit there, sitting there 8 hours, 4 days a week. Things can get oversaturated on both sides, and really pulling out what each individual person has resonated with, I think, is truly an impossible task. But I mean, hopefully we will find out by the end of the week.
Nick, quick break from the pod because this episode is presented by our friends over at SeatGeek. Your next best night ever is waiting, my friend, and they've got the tickets. You want to go to an NBA game, an NFL game, a concert, Major League Baseball, whatever it is, all you got to do is go to SeatGeek.com. You're going to enter in the promo code Can We Please Talk, and you're going to get $20 off that purchase right now at SeatGeek. Nick, what are you going to do with your $20 off on those tickets, buddy?
I mean, that saves me on anything. I can get food at the game. I can just get the tickets themselves. I mean, baseball's coming along, so I'm excited for that. I can get upper deck tickets and just nothing. And then just all I got to do is worry about food. I mean, anywhere I want to use this, it's well worth it. $20 is a worthwhile investment.
That's right. And I've seen you at sporting events. You eat a lot. Nick needs those $20 off. So go to SeatGeek.com right now. Enter in the promo code Can We Please Talk. You're going to get $20 off that purchase. Nick, today's episode is presented as always by our friends over at Fresh Roasted Coffee. Since 2009, their passion has always been bringing you gourmet coffees from all over the world, roasted fresh to order. I got my coffee snob here, Nick Severi. Nick, tell these people, coffee snob it up here. Tell these people why Fresh Roasted Coffee is so good and why they're the official sponsor of Can We Please Talk.
Often the best cup of coffee that you're ever going to have is the one you can make from home. And you need good quality coffee to do that. And that's what Fresh Roasted Coffee offers. Between single origin, between blends, flavors, anything on the coffee spectrum they've got. But more importantly, and I can't stress this enough, often when you purchase coffee, you don't know where to start. I mean, there's so many different varieties, so many different opportunities, so many different things you could choose from. And Fresh Roasted Coffee just gives you a very simple questionnaire and just says, hey, figure out what your coffee cup is. Figure out what blend works for you. I've gotten some single origin recommendations, so has Mike, and that's influenced everything. And what they recommend, you can get in a Keurig cup, the way Mike takes it. You can take it in the way I do it, which is typically through a French press, or you can get it for a percolator. Whatever coffee machine you've got, they've got you covered. But more importantly, just a huge variety and a way to learn more about coffee itself.
And all of this is available at freshroastedcoffee.com on their site. One cup is all it takes to fall in love with Fresh Roasted Coffee, but you get a discount for being a listener of Can We Please Talk. Enter in the promo code Can We Please Get 20 to get 20% off your first purchase. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com today. All right. Well, I mean, I'm not going to make a prediction on this case, but either way, the former president has been campaigning off of this case. We know he's been going out to different stops. He's done something in Wildwood, New Jersey, where Mike Leon, when he was a Rutgers graduate, was partying down there in Wildwood. Maybe, maybe not. We know that he recently made a stop in my old hometown in Crotona Park out in the South Bronx. And Ximena, I want to ask you a question off of this because the former president has been making these stops in these traditional blue dots, and I'm not understanding what's going on. Then I turn on the rally in the South Bronx. I don't see too many people that look like me, but I hear this.
Hello, New York City, and hello to all of the incredible, tough, strong, hardworking American patriots right here in the Bronx. Who would think? Who would think? I'm thrilled to be back in the city I grew up in, the city I spent my life in, the city I helped build, and the city that we all love, New York City. And I'm here tonight to declare that we are going to turn New York City around, and we are going to turn it around very, very quickly. We're going to bring safety back to our streets. We're going to bring success back to our schools. We're going to bring prosperity back to every neighborhood and every borough of the greatest city in our land. We're going to reduce taxes. We're going to bring businesses and big taxpayers back to New York.
I mean, I don't know how quickly. It's been around for a long time. But Ximena, why is the former president? I've been asked this question before, and I'm going to be going on TV to answer this question because, like I mentioned, no joke, I grew up in Crotona Park. This is where my aunt lived. I mean, like I've been to that park many times. I know the ways in and out of that park like the back of my hand. But I also know the community in there is 92% Blacks and Latinos that live in the Bronx, right? Very small percentage of white and Asian folks that live in that area of the Bronx. And it's racking my brain here as we start to see polling numbers show that the former president maybe is making smaller inroads with African Americans. And then obviously I'm here in Miami, so we know what he's done here with Cubans and that demographic. But why is he doing this in terms of these campaign stops and these traditional blue dots? He's not even going to the red dots in the blue states. He's going to the bluest of blue dots in the bluest of blue states. What says Ximena Bustillo, who's been out on the campaign trail talking to voters? What do you make of the former president stopping up in the South Bronx?
I mean, I think a part of it quite genuinely is scheduling. We was up in the air whether or not we were going to have court today. And I think that if he wanted to do something tonight, having a quick access to a place where he could hold a rally like a few hours after court would have been scheduled to get out would have been a really safe way to do it. He has long been complaining that he's not able to campaign and rally as much as he would like to because he is in New York 4 days a week for court. Same thing with New Jersey. I agree Wildwood was a choice, but it also is not that far from Pennsylvania. And, that is a swing state, and that is a place where he is looking to court some voters. And so I think that there is definitely no shortage of reason to still go to other places. And I think he's making that work and clearly trying to tout that as much as possible. New York, I think, is a very interesting place for him because clearly you can hear it. He takes ownership of it. He reminds that this is his home, even though his new home state is Florida now. And that's where I think he will likely spend a lot more time versus New York when he gets the chance to. But he's done other campaign stops here. He went to a bodega. He went to visit some construction union workers. And he's done a few other things, in the middle of trial, I think, to still show that he is touting the issues that he is touting, even in very blue areas. The other side here is showing what he sees as a Democrat ran area, right? And almost using that as a bit of a poster child for the people outside. There definitely is some very pointed messaging when it comes to that.
It's funny that you said a lot of the same things that I've said about the Wildwood one because of it not being so far away from Pennsylvania. It's racking me because it's like, I'm so glad you put it in perspective about the scheduling part of it, because it is true. Like, it's very easy to make a campaign stop, 20 minutes away from the Manhattan courthouse, because of the scheduling conflict. But if the campaign wasn't flush with funds, would they do that and go up to the Bronx where they know, they probably have slim to none chance of winning, obviously, in New York, or even somebody that's running against AOC winning, in November. I did want to ask you, because you've obviously, I mentioned it before, you've done a lot on the campaign trail. You did a story a while back, if I recall, and I think you were in Arizona and you were talking to a couple of Mormon women voters that are starting to reject the former president and some fraying GOP support in this key state of Arizona. And obviously, networks are now doing coverage devoted to battleground states, right? Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Pennsylvania. We're going to do this all up until November. You've been traveling all across the Western Hemisphere there. I don't even think that's the Western Hemisphere. You know what I mean? So you've been doing all of this. You've been talking to voters there. First, take us inside a little bit of your travels in the state of Arizona. You're talking about both of these candidates. What do you hear? And then take us a little bit inside this story, because this story is at a core issue that the GOP is going to have to answer for come November. So what were you hearing from voters out there in Arizona?
Absolutely. Arizona is such a fascinating state. It is definitely my personal favorite to cover just because of the varying levels of diversity that you have there. 1/3 of registered voters are registered as independents. And I always say that Arizona is one of the only states where someone can tell me that they're an independent, and I genuinely believe them. Like if I looked at their voting track record, they have probably party switched before in their lives. And so that to me already makes it perfectly fascinating. In addition to just demographically, everything else that you have going on. It is a border state. Abortion is going to be one of the top issues voted on their ballot this year. Very significant Latino and Hispanic population. You also have a very large and strong Native American and Indigenous population. So I think that there's just so much at play in Arizona economically, demographically, politically, that it just makes it almost anyone's game, which is the idea of a battleground state. One thing that I have found very interesting is that former President Donald Trump has not held any events there this year. In fact, he has canceled going to events there 3 times, opting for events elsewhere. In one instance, he went to Ohio instead to support a senatorial candidate there. And I heard he was supposed to be there this week as well, and did not go and stayed in New York instead. And so I think that has been a very interesting dynamic within the GOP there. But adding to the layers of that, and this kind of goes into a little bit more of the LDS and the Mormon population in Arizona, is that you have candidates that are particularly of the more right-wing flank of the Republican Party winning primaries, but often when it comes to general elections, they're not very successful. And so we've seen this in the 2022 gubernatorial race. We have seen this in senators' races, and we saw this with President Biden winning the state and being the first Democrat to win the state since Clinton. And even before Clinton, it had been, I'm pretty sure, decades since another Democrat had won that state. So not very many Democrats win for president in Arizona.
That's true. Not many. And we all know what happened in 2020 and the ire of some people with election night being called a little bit early. We know about that. I told people already. I explained to them how the election desks work. If you don't want to listen to me, let me ask you a question, Ximena, because obviously you're covering the trial now. The trial's about to wind down. But as this trial starts to end, what's your focal point next in terms of coverage? Because we got a big debate happening June 27th. I would love to get your thoughts on the debate. But first, let's talk about for Ximena Bustillo, like what's next on your plate in terms of, is it covering voters in different states? Is it getting reaction off of the debate? Because I think the debate happening in June actually is pretty smart, even though we're kind of circumventing traditional norms of the convention process. But like, what do you make of the first debate happening on June 27th? And then what are you doing coverage wise after the trial starts to wrap up here?
Very existential questions that you're asking me here. Everyone keeps asking themselves, what is life after trial? And it's giving really big graduating from high school energy. That is definitely the sentiment. I mean, life after trial for me is, unless for some reason, which knock on wood, there's, a mistrial and we have to do this all over again, which is technically one of the options on the table. I will be hitting back the campaign trail. I hope to, of course, go back to Arizona. It's one of my assigned states. I have my eye on Ohio and Montana as well. But I do have various demographic populations that I do personally cover: rural voters and Native American voters, as well as climate policy. And climate policy often really comes to the forefront in the summer as temperatures get hotter, as there are wildfires, as things get smokier. And so that might be something that also comes across my radar really heavily. I mean, the debate coming at the end of June, there are plenty of things to keep in mind for that, particularly what kinds of questions and things we're going to be asking of people when they're paying attention. But I think ultimately we want to talk to voters on the ground and meet them where they're at and see how they're feeling over the next several months. And 6 months can change an election. I think we've learned that over the last few cycles.
When you were speaking to reporters, because I mean, a reporter, excuse me, to voters out on the trail, because none of this had been decided yet in terms of the debates. We didn't even know if these two guys were going to debate. Now that we're getting them to debate, were you hearing from anybody like, I would like to see them debate? Was that one of the questions that you were posing to some of these folks as you're asking them about their issues? What were some of the answers that you were kind of getting?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think, from Democrats wanted to see Biden debate. I think they wanted to see that choice come up. There are some independent voters that also really wanted to see them both have that conversation and go head to head. So I think absolutely, like having that option to just hear that and see that is good. I think hearing that a candidate does not want to debate tends to automatically raise just some suspicion flags for even the most average people of why wouldn't you want to, what are you afraid of? And so I think like having that option is great. Whether or not people tune in, whether or not anyone really pays attention, I mean, that is a whole separate question.
Oh, well, I'll be excited to see that because I hope they tune in, right? As I'm doing some coverage of this stuff on the debates for the different networks. I did want to ask you, because I'd be remiss, Captain Obvious question here. When you were doing these focus groups, what did people make of the trials themselves? Because now we have one that's winding down. So when you're going to start this new acronym LAT, Life After Trial, that you've coined here on the show. So now when people start actually thinking about either a guilty verdict or not guilty verdict, was it factoring into their decision-making process when you were asking these questions? What do we make of that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think at the time that I was out on the road and talking to people, which was right before the trial began, it still didn't really sink in that this was happening. And I think that for a lot of Americans, this is a very complicated case. It is the least sexiest of all the other ones. The DC one obviously being related to the insurrection on January 6th, Georgia being related to the 2020 election, and Florida is that document situation that really went viral for a few months. And so this one just doesn't have the same catchy PR. And I think that it's easy for it to slip off of people's radar. But, polling has recently showed that particularly among independents, a conviction can really make a difference on whether they vote for him or not. Again, we're still so far away from the election. Who's to say? But it's definitely worth for me and other journalists to continue to follow that question and see how people's minds change over the next several months.
She's been getting very little sleep because she's been covering this trial. She's doing all of this work. You can go listen to her across the family of NPR shows. You can go check out her work at npr.org. This is why we bring folks on like you, Ximena. I can't thank you enough for giving us some time today and filling in for Nick. And stay at it at the trials. We'll be talking to you after the trials are done, and stay at it on the campaign trail, and continued success to you. Please stay safe.
Absolutely. Anytime, Mike.
All right, that's our show. Our thank yous, as always, to Ximena Bustillo. Go check out her work over at npr.org, or you can go listen to her across all of the different podcasts that she goes on over at NPR. She's been on the Politics podcast. She's on a Morning Edition. So you can go check her out. You want to check out the video portions of any of the interviews we've done with Ximena and other guests on this show, head over to our YouTube channel, type in Can We Please Talk Podcast. We should pop right up. Do me a favor while you're there. Hit subscribe. Audio podcast platforms, by now, Apple, Spotify, Google. Shout out to everybody who listens to us over on Good Pods. Shout out to Acast, our hosting platform. We can't do it without them, and we can't do it without each and every one of you that listens to this program. As always, I'm Mike Leon. We'll see everybody next time.